All right, I will say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin by thanking all of our sponsors, our TALMUD TORAH sponsors for the month of Teves. Mrs. Selma Woolf for dedicating all the Shiurim and Drashos this month with immense gratitude for the refuos from Hashem and the merit of refuah for all of those in need in the zchus of our brave soldiers and return of our hostages. Leah Sol as a zchus for refuah sheleima for her daughter Ilana Bas Esther for the safety of our soldiers and the safe return of all of the hostages to their families. Our day of learning sponsor, Mrs. Bracha Shoop, in memory of the yahrzeit of her father, Albert Hamaoui, Fran Hisler, in memory of her beloved father, Avram Ben Sender B'Malko, whose yahrzeit is today. Our Daf Yomi sponsors for today, Malka and Simi Esther, in honor of their son Ari's engagement to Dorit Bandik of Miami, Florida. Mazel tov, mazel tov. Maybe we should move this year there. It might not be a bad idea, right? Certainly in the morning like this. Mazel tov, Hashem should be zocha. To walk the chassan down to the chuppah b'sha'a tova u'mitzlachas and see them build a binyan adi'ad and meh ve'esrim shanim tovos. Our Daf Yomi sponsor, Paul Pollack, is in honor of Ira Grossman with Hakara Sato for having taken the initiative to take pictures of his grandson Simcha, putting on tefillin for the first day. They are wonderful and a tremendous demonstration of Avas Chinam. Wishing him safe travels back to his home in Eretz Yisrael. Beautiful. We dedicate the shir to the soldiers who fell in battle yesterday. Staff Sergeant Sufyan Dagash and Sergeant First Class Marion Moshe Gersh. We hope that in the merit of our TALMUD TORAH, their Neshama will have an aliya and their families in Neshama. And of course, we dedicate all of Maseches Bava Kamo, Li'ilui Nishmas Master Sergeant Eliyahu Michal Harush Hashem Yikom Damo. May our Torah provide an aliya for his Neshama and Nechama for his family. I will say with that, let us begin. We have a lot to do today. Today's daf is Samech Beis, 62, and we are picking up actually at the Mishnah on 61b. The Gemara, thank you. On 61b, let me just go. 61b. So the Gemara says, remember again, this is one of these machlokas we've been referencing for so long, the machlokas Rabbi Hy'd and the Rabbanon about Tamun, about when Aish goes ahead and damages something that is hidden in a field, is there liability or not? Rabbi Yehuda says there is. The Rabbanon say that you are potter. So let's analyze. It says the Gemara, Amarav Kahana, Machlokes b'malik b'soch shalo, v'halcha v'achla b'soch shal chavero. Shav Kahana says like this. Where is the Machlokes Rabbi Yehuda and the Rabbanon? The Machlokes is where I light a fire in my field, and then the fire travels to Ruvain's field and does damage there. What's the Machlokes? It's Rabbi Yehuda mechayv aniskei tamen be'esh. Rabbi Yehuda says that you're chayiv even for damages done to things that are hidden in the field. For Rabbanon patri, the Rabbanon say that you're pater. Avol, the mavdik b'soch shel chavero. But I will say, watch this. If you kindle a fire in someone's field, I go over to Reuven's field, and I light a fire in his field, in that case, everyone agrees that you have to pay for everything, that which is seen and that which is tamun. Rabbi said, now what's the logic? What's the distinction? The distinction actually is pretty simple. The distinction is, if I light a fire in my own field, so that's not an act of negligence, right? In other words, the act of lighting a fire in my field is my right. That's where the Rabbanon will say you're patur on tamun. But again, I will say, if I go over to Reuven's field and light a fire in his field, there's no license to do that. In other words, there's no right to do that. There's no patur that says there's no permission to do that. And therefore, again, even the Rabbanon would agree that there is complete liability, whether it's for the items that you know about or the items you don't know about. That's Rav Kahana's position. Come, Amalei Rava. Rava says, if that's the case, so it comes along Rava, and Rava says like this: if that's true, then halacha l'maisa, the Mishnah should read differently. Well, remember again, what did the Mishnah say? After, according to Machlokes Rabbi Hy'd and the Rabbanon, with Tamun in the field, they bring up the case of Madlikes Habira. I burned down Reuven's house. So everyone agrees that in the case of burning down Reuven's house, that's what? I am liable for everything inside of the house. What's the logic there? The logic there is because people keep stuff in their house. That's what I was supposed to say. The Torah of Tamun is related to the concept that it's not common for people to keep utensils in their field. What's normal to be in a field? Produce, crops, vegetation. That's normal. But kalim, utensils, that's abnormal. That's why the Rabbanon exempt you. But in a home where it's common to keep all kinds of stuff, Therefore, halacha l'maisa, even the Rabbanan would agree that you're liable for everything. Well, if that's the case, instead of bringing down the home in the Mishnah, why not say as follows? Why not say, Liflog v'lifnei day? Go ahead and literally make a distinction in the initial case of the Mishnah. One is it so that the Rabbanan say that you're pater for tamun, b'madlik b'soch shelo v'halcha v'achla b'soch shel chaveiro. If you light a fire in your own field and the fire then spreads into the field of your friend, aval madlik b'soch shel chaveiro. But if halacha l'maisa you go ahead and you kindle a fire directly in your friend's field, in other words, you do something illegal. I walk over to Reuven's field and I light a fire in Reuven's field. I have no right to do that. In that case, divrei hakol shalim kol ma shehaya b'socho. Everyone will agree, even the Rabbanon, that halacha l'maisa, you're chayiv for everything, crops, vegetation, utensils, anything that's in the field. Now, I will say, of course, what the Gemara is suggesting is the fact that the Mishnah doesn't do that would seem to indicate that Rav Kahana's position is incorrect. Okay, but nevertheless, that's Rav Kahana's position. Comes along Rava. Rava says, no, Rav Kahana, I disagree with you. And I will say this, of course, is going to become the authoritative version of the Mishnah. Rava, or the authoritative version of the Machlokes. Rava, be'tarti pligi. The Machlokes Shabbat and the Rabbanan is actually in both cases. Pligi. So we'll say number one case that they argue with, which is the paradigmatic case. I light a fire in my field, and what happens? The fire spreads. And then extends ultimately again into Reuven's field. Okay? Now we'll say in that case, what's the machlokes? Rabbi Yehuda mechayiv ataman beish, v'Rabbanan savi lo mechayiv. Okay, so we'll say that's the paradigmatic machlokes by Talmud, and the one we have in the Mishnah. Rabbanan say, I'm not chayiv on Talmud. Rabbi Yehuda says, I am chayiv on Talmud. That's case one. But there's more. What's more? Upligi nami b'malik b'shel chavero. The truth is, according to Rav Rabbi, the machlokes is also in a case where I go into Reuven's field and mamish intentionally light the fire there. What's the machlokes? Rabbi Yehuda savar mishalin kol ma'aseh b'socho va'afilu arniki. Okay, now watch this. Rabbi Yehuda holds Rabbi saying, remember, Rabbi Yehuda pretty much categorically rejects the concept of Talmud. So therefore he holds that you are going to be chayiv for everything that's found in Reuven's field. But here's the difference. Generally, we're going to see, according to Rabbi, that Rabbi Yehuda will say, you're chayiv for things that would normally be found in a field. In other words, I ignite the fire in my field, and what happens? It spreads ultimately to Reuven's field, and it burns Reuven's tractor, right? Tractor is not a good thing of Talmud, right? It burns his, let's say the plow, right? The plow is, you can't see it, right? It's hidden inside of the crops. Or it burns a shovel, right? Some other things that would be normal to be in the field. But something that wouldn't normally be in the field, it appears that even Rabbi Yehuda would hold that you should be pater for that. But when is that so? That, and Rabbi Gedalia, this is your point, right? But ultimately, when is that so? That's so when you're kindling a fire in your own field and it spreads. But if you do something as damaging as I go over to Reuven's field and I light the fire in Reuven's field, then what? I'm chayiv for everything. See, even if Reuven had a pile of gold, sitting in his field, or he left his wallet in his field, Rabbi Yehuda would say, I'm chayiv for that as well. So the Gemara says, however, the Rabbanan say, Kelim shedarkan lahatmin begadish kigon morigin uklei bakar hudu mishalim. The Rabbanan will say, Rabbi Yehuda, I agree with you that when someone goes over, I go over to go ahead and light the fire in Reuven's field, that I'm going to be chayiv for everything. But everything only means what? Still, utensils that are normal to keep in the field. He says, for example, morigin right? Morigin are threshing tools, right? Clay bakar, different utensils used for my cows. That's when I'll pay. But things that ultimately, again, are not commonly found in the field, that I would not be chayiv for. I will say, so this is incredibly important. So watch this. Let's just take a step back here for just a second. So here's how Rava frames the machlokes. So first of all, what Rava says is the machlokes Rabbi Yehuda and the Rabbanon. really applies in both scenarios. In scenario 1, where I light the fire in my field and it spreads to Reuven's field, and in scenario 2, where I light the fire in Reuven's field. Okay, so what's the machlokes in both cases? Case number 1 is the classic machlokes. I light the fire in my field, it spreads to Reuven's field, and Reuven has property inside of the field, and the fire destroys the property as well. So, but the property was hidden, right? Meaning it wasn't visible. It was hidden. So what's halacha? So the Rabbanan say, Tamun, you're pater. You're pater. Rabbi Yehuda says, Tamun, you're chayiv. You're chayiv. Now Rabbi say, now interestingly enough, it would appear based on the qualification of this machlokas that ultimately, again, when does Rabbi Yehuda say you're chayiv? He says you're chayiv for items normally kept in a field. Now the Gemara gives examples. What are items normally kept in a field? Agricultural tools, farming tools, animal tools. That's what you're chayiv for Tamun. But even Rabbi Yehuda would agree that if you have something in that field, right, I light a fire in my field, it spreads to Reuven's field, and it turns out that Reuven decides to keep his, his gold, in his field. Even Rabbi Yehuda would agree, no, you're not chayiv for that. That's not reasonable for that to be in a field. That's machlokes 1. Machlokes 2, according to Rava, is I go over to Reuven and I light a fire in Reuven's field. In that case, Rabbi Yehuda says, because that is such an act of damage, such a posheya, such a damager, I'm chayiv for everything. Vegetation, stuff that's hidden, but even the stuff that wouldn't normally be in a field. The Rabbanon, on the other hand, say, will make you chayiv for basic tamun, i.e. stuff that's visible and that's not visible, as long as it's normally in a field. But if it's not normally in a field, the Rabbanon would still hold that Allah so you're not liable for that. So I will say, this is the version of the machlokes, ultimately, again, according to Rava. Incredible. So let's go back there. Says the Gemara, Rabbanon, Vidalku. So we'll say, so now remember again, Gemara is now quoting from the Mishnah. What happens if I go ahead and I set Reuven's house on fire, and inside of Reuven's house is stuff, right? His stuff. What's talacha? So Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Mishalim Komashai, Brisa, not the Mishnah, I'm sorry. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Mishalim Komashai Besocho. Rabbi Yehuda says you have to pay for everything. You have to pay for everything. The Chachamim Omrim, the Chachamim say, Eino Mishalim Ela Godish Shalchitin. I'm sorry, I read this wrong. Madlikis HaGodish. I go and I ignite Reuven's field, I go and ignite Reuven's field, and inside of the field there were utensils. The utensils burned as well. So what's the halacha? Rabbi Yehuda Omer Mishalim Komashai Besocho. So Rabbi Yehuda holds that halacha l'maisi you have to pay for everything, because he doesn't hold of Talmud. The Chachamim say, Eino Mishalim Ela Godish Shalchitin, O Godish Shal Sa'orin. Chacham say you only pay for the actual the field and the vegetation itself, the crops, right? Whether it's standing grain or standing barley or piled barley, piled grain. V'roin makom kelim ki'ilu hu malei tvua. Now both say, now this is very interesting. So now let's go. So remember again, the Rabbanon hold that in general you are pater for tamun, right? In general. I go ahead and I ignite a fire. The fire goes into Reuven's field. It destroys his standing crop. I'm chayiv for that. He had other utensils hidden inside of the field. I'm not liable for that. That's the Rabbanon. The Brisa adds in a very interesting qualification. However, both say, the Rabbanon will say, while we won't hold you liable for tamun, the space that the utensil occupied, we view that space as if it was filled with grain. So whereas you won't be liable for the utensils that are lost, but nevertheless we'll try to recapture some of the loss by viewing, okay, if the utensils weren't there would be standing grain there, we'll make you liable for that grain. Interesting. Top of Samech Beis 62a. When is that so? So once again, what case are we talking about over here? I lit a fire in my field, and the fire extended into Reuven's field. But if I went into Reuven's field and they mamish lit the fire in Reuven's field, then what? Divrei hakol, although it takes out over here the divrei hakol takes this out. But whatever, divrei hakol, mishalin komashaya besocho. The Evro says again, if I go ahead and I kindle the fire in Reuven's field, everyone agrees, even the Rabbanon, that you're chayiv for everything. you're chai for everything. Now we'll say, so this is just restating what we just saw before, just adding in that extra knech, right? What's being added over here? What's being added over here is that even when the Rabbanan say that you're patur on tamun, they view the area occupied by the grain as if it was filled with utensils. I'm sorry, just the opposite. They view the area occupied by the utensils as if it was filled with grain. That's the knech. That's the knech over here. I'll say, but again, same idea. All of this is said when you're lighting a fire in your field and it spreads to your friends. But if halacha l'maaseh, you do something so damaging, right? You do something so bemazed, so as to go over to another person's field and light a fire in their field, even the Rabbanon will say that you're chayiv for utensils that are damaged. Incredible. Umod Rabbi Huda Chachamim, and Rabbi Huda agrees with the Chacham. It's an interesting case here. B'mash shemakom lechavero lahagdish godish. So we'll say, imagine the following scenario. I lend Reuven space in my field to pile his grain. Okay? I lend him space to pile his grain. Vehigdish vehitmin. Reuven piles his grain and he hides utensils inside of his grain. Inside of the grain. Even Rabbi Hudu agrees, she'in mishalim el demei gadish bilvad. Ultimately, that I, the owner of the space, because in other words, I rented the space to Reuven. So obviously now what happens? A fire breaks out in my field, spreads to Reuven's wheat, consumes the wheat, but also ends up consuming the utensils inside of it. Even Rabbi Hudu agrees that I'm only obligated to pay for the amount of the wheat, right? Not for the utensils. What's the logic? Rashi says over here, second line down from the El Demei Godish, Imeviru Balasada Delo Kabil Ale Ela Nitirusa de Godish. Now both said this is very important, because what's the case over here? The case over here is, I say to Reuven, right? Reuven asks me if he could go ahead and borrow some space to store his grain. I say, sure, he wants to pile his grain. I give him a piece of land. Here. Now both said, obviously, when I'm lending him land, what else am I doing? I'm accepting a certain level of responsibility just to not damage him. So both say, what level of responsibility am I accepting? Well, I'm only accepting based on what he told me. What did he tell me? He's storing grain. What didn't he tell me? That he's storing utensils. Therefore, my liability is capped at whatever it is he asked of me. He asked for grain, I granted grain, and therefore, again, I'm not liable for anything else. And even Rabbi Yehuda will agree in this case that if it turns out that he hid utensils in there, I am not liable for that. We'll say a very interesting carve out. Well, again, it's logical. You can never be responsible for more than what you accepted responsibility for, based on what the other person told you you're accepting responsibility for. So if Reuven asks me to go ahead and pile grain on my land, and I say, sure, I have no reason to expect that there's anything other than grain being piled on my field. Therefore, again, that's what my liability is capped at. Really very interesting. Similarly, again, we'll say, lahagdish chitin vehigdish seorin. So we'll say, for example, so let's say Reuven went ahead and asked to go ahead and pile wheat, and it ends up that he ends up piling barley, right? Vehigdish chitin v'chipan seorin, or he went ahead and he piled wheat and, right, the higdish chitin, right, and he went ahead and he ends up piling wheat, chitin v'chipan b'seorin, or he piles wheat and he ends up covering it with barley, seorin v'chipan b'chitin, or he piles barley and he ends up covering with wheat, she'eno meshalim ela demei seorin bilvad. Both in all of these cases, halacha l'maisa, I only have to pay the value of the barley. The value of the barley. Rashi says over here, chitin v'chipan b'seorin, I will say in all of these cases, what the common denominator is I think that I'm accepting responsibility only for the barley. I see even in this case, ultimately again, where for example, Reuven asked me to go ahead and put wheat on my field, right? And I say, sure. And then he puts wheat, but he covers the wheat with barley. So that when I see it, I assume that what is he keeping there? Barley. So again, I will say, halacha l'maisa, my liability cannot be any more than what I'm able to see, even though he asked me for wheat. Since it looks like barley, most of barley is all assuming that barley, of course, is less expensive than wheat, right? That's the assumption the Gemara is always working with. Good. So we'll say, that's the halacha. So we'll say, bottom line, what's interesting is, actually we won't get to bottom line yet, but I will say, but it seems to be clear that the Gemara is adopting the position of Rava and rejecting the position of Rav Kahana. Therefore, again, I will say what that means is the machlokes Rabbi Yehuda and the Rabbanan about tamun extends in both cases. the case where I light the fire in my field and it extends into Reuven's field, and the case in which I light the fire in Reuven's field directly. What's the machlokes? In case number 1, where I light the fire in my field and it extends into Reuven's field, so in that case again, and now it turns out my fire that started in my field that goes to Reuven's field destroyed Reuven's crops, and he also had utensils in the field. Rabbi Yehuda will say, you're chayiv for everything. The Rabbanon will say, chayiv for the crops, pater on the hidden utensils. That is called tamun. That's case 1. Case 2, I go and I light a fire in Reuven's field, destroys his crops and hidden utensils. Ultimately, but when we say hidden, just to qualify, doesn't mean that Reuven necessarily actively went to hide them. It means they're not visible. They're not visible. Like if you could imagine the site with like standing grain. So in standing grain, whatever stuff is on the ground, you don't see it. You don't see it. So in that case number 2, where I light the fire and ultimately it destroys grain, crops, as well as utensils. So in that case, Rabbi was saying, Rabbi Yehuda will say that you're chayiv for everything. What does everything mean? Everything means crops, utensils, whether utensils would normally be there or not normally be there. You're chayiv for everything. The Rabbanon will say crops and utensils that would normally be there. But for stuff that wouldn't normally be in a field, halacha l'maaseh, the Rabbanon will say that you're not chayiv. So we'll say, so that's where we're holding with this machlokes right now. Okay, let's go back. We're not finished. Amar Rava, very interesting case here. Hanosim dinar zav liisha v'amar la hizar ibo shal kasafu. So we'll say, let's say a man gives over to a woman. Now the fact that it's a woman is irrelevant over here. That's just scenario the Gemara is choosing. A man gives over to a woman a gold dinar, and he says to her, "Listen, watch this for me, and be very careful. It's pure silver." Okay, so what's the halacha? Hizikaso, let's say she damages it. In other words, she's actively negligent and she damages it. Mishalemes dinar zav. Ultimately, again, she has to go ahead and pay back a dinar zav. Why? Mishum da'amarla, my havis lech gabe da'as kase. Because we'll say, here's the difference. He says to her, you actively damaged this. In other words, you damaged this. In other words, we'll say, if you can imagine, he gives her, right, he goes ahead and he gives her a dinar. He says, be careful, it's a gold dinar. Be careful with this, it's pure silver. So one day she gets angry at him. And what does she do? She throws it into the sea. So in that case, she's chayiv for a gold dinar. Why? Because we'll say, what right do you have to actively damage the property of another? That's what it means. What right do you have to damage? So therefore, full liability. On the other hand, pashabo, let's say again she's negligent and it's stolen from her. Right? She just doesn't, right? She's stolen from her. So mishalemes kashal kasef. She only has to pay back the value of a silver dinar. Why? The amrlei netirusa de kaspa kabili alai, netirusa de dava lo kabili alai. Because she says, listen, I accepted upon myself responsibility to watch a silver dinar because that's what you told me. I did not accept the responsibility to watch a gold dinar. Therefore, again, I will say, see this interesting distinction? If she herself actively damages it, then we kind of like we throw the book at her. Like, what are you doing? What are you doing? So pay for a gold dinar. But if something just happens, again, she might be negligent, but she doesn't mean to damage it, then she's only chayiv for what she thinks she accepted responsibility for, i.e. a silver dinar. Incredible. Amrli Rav Mordechai Rav Ashi, Asun b'derabba masnisola. You explain this position of Mishnah according to Rava. Anam masnisan pshitalan. But we learn out the shita from the Mishnah. How so? Chitin v'chipan v'sa'orin. Right? If he went ahead and piled wheat and covered it with barley, sa'orin v'chipan v'chitan, took barley and covered it with wheat. Eno mishalim ela demei sa'orin bilbad. Ultimately, again, you only have to pay the value of barley. Alma. Amarle nitirusa de sari kabila alai. Therefore, again, why? Because ultimately, again, the person watching the produce says, I only accepted upon myself the responsibility for barley. Hachanami amrale nitirusa de daba lo kabili alai. Again, I'll say the same case before. Therefore, again, she says, you told me it was a silver dinar. And therefore, again, I accepted upon myself the responsibility to watch a silver dinar and nothing more. Okay? Amarav, Shamis Milsel Rabbi Yehuda v'lo yedana maihi. So the Gemara says, listen to this. So Rav said, I heard an explanation, ultimately again, according to Rabbi Yehuda, but I don't remember what it was. V'lo yidana maihi. Amar Shmuel, v'lo yoda abba mashmielei Rabbi Yehuda. So I'm sorry. So Amar Shmuel says v'lo yidana abba mashmielei. So ultimately, again, right? Does his father not remember what he heard? Rabbi Yehuda de mechayev al niskei tamun be'esh asu takhanas nigzal be'isha. We'll say this is riveting. Watch this. So he reminds him, Father, I'll tell you what you heard. According to Rabbi Yehuda, who holds that you're chayav for tamud, right? They both say this is Rabbi Yehuda in our Mishnah. Rabbi Yehuda holds that halacha l'maisa, when I light a fire and it goes down and damages Ruvain's field, so not only am I liable ultimately again for the damaged crop which is visible, but if there were other utensils in the field, even if they were not visible, I am chayav for damaging them as well. According to Rabbi Yehuda, they extended the takana of theft to fire. What's the takana of theft to fire? Say, take a look at Rashi. Asu takanas nigzal ve'isho. Rashi says, Kihechi de tiknu rabbanon lenigzal lishava kama gazlo v'hi. Told us on Maseches Shavuos. Elu nishbatin v'notlin hasocher v'nigzal kach tiknu be'isho sheyishba mahit mevito. Both say, watch this. This is fascinating. Here's the case. Let's talk about takanas nigzal. Takanas nigzal says like this. I come to Beis Din, I say, Ruvain stole from me $1,000. $1,000. Shabbos says that the halacha is that I could take a shavua, and if I'm willing to swear to the amount, ultimately I could collect based on my shavua. So the Gemara wants to suggest over here as follows, that the same takana applies to Eish as well, meaning according to Rabbi Yehuda. Let's say again, I light a fire goes into Ruvain's field, fire destroys Ruvain's field and his utensils. There's tamun. Then I will say, what's the problem with tamun destruction? What's the problem? No one knows. In other words, Ruvain claims he knows, but I'm like, I don't know, like Hamaoui chaver lavaraya. In other words, even according to Rabbi Yehuda, who says that I'm chayiv for tamun damage that I caused, but how do we know what was really damaged? So according to Rabbi Yehuda must extend the takana of theft over to Eish and says that what? Reuven could show up in Beis Din, claim, now again, I will say, obviously the damage to the crops, that we could assess. We know it was a field, we know how much a field is worth, right? So that we could assess. But what happened? What do you do with Tamun? Reuven says, Silber's fire destroyed $10,000 worth of equipment in my field, and he swears. He takes a shvuah. And if he's willing to take a shvuah over that, then ultimately, again, I could be forced to pay as a result of that shvuah. So that the same takana that applies to a case of theft, Rabbi Yehuda applies it to Tamun by Eish. Fascinating. We'll say second wide line, Samech Beis Mud Aleph. So when it says, Baya Meimar, Asu takanas nigzal b'masar or lo. So we'll say this is interesting. Did they extend the takana of the nigzal to a masar? We'll say, what's a moser? A moser ultimately, again, is someone who hands over another Jew to a corrupt government and causes the corrupt government to extort money from them. So it's one Jew goes ahead and gives over right to another Jew and says again, as a result of that Mesira, we'll call it Reuven gives over Shimon loses money. So we'll say, so now, can Shimon come to Beis Din? Can Shimon come to Beis Din and go ahead and claim, well, Reuven, you cost me $10,000. Could he do that? Does that work? And swear to them and then cause Reuven to pay. Olo. So aliba demandam lo daininan dinan digarmi lo tibaylecha dimesiros nami lo daininan. So I will say. So now this is very interesting. We're going to get into this about grama and garmi, and we will discuss. There's a huge raging machlokes. Are there two concepts of causation or one concept of causation? We're going to see that machlokes later on. For now, I'll say what we're just going to go with is the idea, just for the sake of keeping it a little bit simpler, is that grama and garmi are the same thing. Just two different words for the same thing, meaning causation. So according to the opinion that says that in general, by monetary law, you're not chayiv for secondary damages, you're not chayiv for grama, for causation. So they would agree about say moser, right? Informing on another Jew is causation. I'm not damaging him, right? I'm not punching him in the face. I'm not going ahead and actually stealing the money from his pocket. I'm creating a scenario through which another Jew is suffering a financial loss. Okay, so according to the opinion that holds that essentially we don't get involved in grama by nezikin, causation by damages, then you wouldn't get involved in this case as well. Kiti by the house. Where does the question come up? According to the opinion that says that I will say even in cases of causation, we do, Beis Din does get involved. So what's the halacha over here? Asu takanas nigzal b'maser dimishtaba v'shakil olo. So we'll say that's our shaila. So imagine the following scene. Ruvain informs on Shimon, hands him over to a despotic, corrupt government. As a result, Shimon loses $5,000. Shimon now shows up in Beis Din and he says, listen, Ruvain caused me a loss. We don't know. We don't have a way of independently corroborating how much the loss was. So Shimon said, I'm willing to take a shvuah, just like by theft, right? Just like by tamun. I'm willing to take a shvuah to say, I swear that Ruvain's Mesira cost me $5,000. So do we extend the takana of theft, takana sanigzal, to this case as well? Allow Shimon to take an oath that Ruvain's Mesira, Ruvain's act of informing, cost him $5,000, let him collect based on that. The Gemara says, Teku. Okay, so both say, so what's interesting is, what the Gemara is suggesting over here, so just fascinating. So we have our takanas hanigzal, which in general says that if someone steals from you and somehow are unable to ascertain or independently corroborate the amount of the theft, if you swear regarding the amount of the theft, that oath enables you to collect. According to Rabbi Yehuda, you could extend that concept to tamun, and then the shaila is, can you extend that concept to a grama case as well? Like a case of Mesira. So we'll say those are our three cases over here. Good. Hogar, what says Kavaita? Hogar, there was a guy. So ultimately, and we'll say, what does he do? He kicks the chest of his friend. Now, not his friend's chest. In other words, his friend has a chest, like a box. Pekaspasta, like a money box. Like kaspasta literally means a money box. So Reuven goes, so I go over to Reuven, I get upset at Reuven, I kick Reuven's money box, Shajeh Benar, and I kick it into the river. Okay, now what happens? So I'll say, so ultimately again, so Reuven comes to Beis, and Reuven says, Silber kicked my money box into the river, and ultimately again, there was $1,000 in there. Yosef Ravashi, the Kama Ayin Bey. So Ravashi was thinking about this and he was pondering. He says, Ki hai gav namai. What is the halacha in this case? So the Gemara says, Amali Ravina Ravacha Breid Rava, V'Amali Ravacha Breid Rava Ravashi, Lav Hanu Masnis in Disnan, Umodim Chacham Rabbi Yehuda B'Madlik Sabira, Shemeshalen Komasha B'Socho, Shekein Derech B'nei Adam Lahaniach Bebatim. So the Gemara says this would be similar to the Mishnah. But say, what was the Mishnah? Last case in the Mishnah, I go ahead and I ignite Reuven's house, and Reuven's entire home goes up in flames. What's the halacha saying? I am liable for everything inside the house. What TALMUD? This is no TALMUD. There's no TALMUD. Why? Because it's common for people to keep stuff in their house. Okay, now how we arrive at the actual amount that was in the house. So it sounds like what Reuven's going to do, like we just said before, Reuven's going to swear, he's going to take a shvuah. This was in my house, that was in my house. But that would be the same thing over here. So Reuven comes to Beis Din. He said, what's the fact? We'll say, what are the facts? The facts we know is, I kicked Reuven's money box into the river. That's what we know. What don't we know? What was in it? So it sounds like Pepashtos. Reuven will tell us what's in it. He'll swear to that. And then based on that, he'll be able to collect. Amalei, you're right. If Reuven was claiming there was $1,000 of cash in my money box, you're right. The case is actually pretty simple. Let Reuven swear, let Reuven take a shvuah, and based on that, ultimately again, he will be liable. Hachanami. What's the case over here? The Katan Marganisa. Well, let's say this is very interesting. Where Reuven claims that ultimately again, Reuven claims that there wasn't money, there were diamonds. So I say, so now already this is a different kind of claim. So the Gemara says, mi manchi inshi marginisa b'kaspas da'olo. So we'll say, here's the question now. The question is, do we go ahead and assume that people keep jewels in a money box or not? In other words, we'll say, if Reuven's claiming money, then the case is straightforward. Swear and collect. The question just is, if he claims that there were jewels in there, that's a little bit of a departure from the norm. So do we accept this claim, or do we say, sorry, the takanas nigzal, essentially the ability to swear and collect, only works when? In what we'll call normative cases. Cases where we expect, but in non-normative cases, ultimately, again, we don't let you take an oath and collect. So the Gemara says, tekel. We'll have to go ahead and leave this as an open-ended question. But I'll say, I'll just point out something really interesting about this. We'll say, what's fascinating about this whole case, right? So let's think about it just a second. I go ahead and I kick Reuven's chest. Chest goes into the river. Okay, so now what's the halacha? He brings me to Beis Din. And now he says, there were $1,000 in my chest. So now, resolution seems to be quite simple. What's resolution? Reuven, take a shua and collect. He'll say, what's halachically troubling about this? What's halachically troubling? We have a principle for the extraction of money. What's the principle of extraction of money? Hamotzi mechaver alav araya. So I don't understand, like I don't know, bring some footage, should I bring, I don't know what, just a shua? So we'll say, what's different about this case? What's different about this case is, I kicked the chest. As we'll say, I got angry, I kicked the chest. From a Musa perspective, what do you see? You see, if you're able to say that the danger of anger is that anger changes all of the rules. Right? When you do something out of anger, so everything, the whole landscape changes. Hamotzi mechaveira alav haraya is a halacha that applies ultimately again between two rational human beings. I go with you, say, you owe me $1,000. You say, no, I don't. I say, yes, you do. Okay, there's a mechanism. The moment you act out of anger, halachic mechanisms to a certain degree, they almost like evaporate. You act out of anger, so suddenly again, you've changed the circumstances. Suddenly now you've created new realities. And the fact that you have acted out of anger makes you the perpetrator, makes you the aggressor, and fundamentally changes what Rabbi said. That's the danger of anger. You talk out of anger, you act out of anger, it changes all of the circumstances around you. We're going to discuss this, we'll see this in next week's parasha, a beautiful stipler. The stipler says, right, we'll see by the second makos. The pasuk says, Vatal hasvardeya. The frog ascended onto the banks of the Nile. So Rashi HaKadosh points out, it says, Sardeya is singular. But ultimately, again, we know that there are frogs everywhere. So what's the pshat? So Rashi quotes the famous medrash, it was one big frog. And what did the Egyptians do? They kept on hitting it. And every time they hit it, more little frogs spawned off. So the stipler asks a simple question. He says, in general, in life, this is good advice. If you see a big frog, and every time you hit it, little frogs come off, logic dictates that what? Good, we'll say, this is free advice. Take it, right? Stop hitting the big frog. If every time you do it, little frogs come off. Stipler says something amazing. He says the Egyptians were known for two things, immorality and kas. He says anger. What does anger do? Anger causes you to act blindly without recognizing the ramifications and implications of your actions. So you could be sitting there, hitting that frog, seeing that every hit is causing you to suffer more because more and more little frogs are coming off. And you know what? You just don't stop. You're so blinded by your anger that you can't stop what you're doing, even though what you're doing is hurting you. It's so the Gemara says over here, it's incredible. I'll say, I got angry. I kicked Reuven's box into the water, into the sea, into the Nar. So I'll say, normally, if somebody wants to extract money from me, Hamotzi mechaver alav araya. Well, not anymore. You acted out of anger, and when you act out of anger, again, you change the landscape. Suddenly now Reuven holds me to Beis Din, he takes an oath, and again, I have to pay. They'll say anger that Rambam brings down is the most detrimental, corrosive, destructive midah that a person could have. To the point that the Rambam says every other midah you're supposed to have like a little bit of, kas, you're supposed to eradicate it. Interestingly enough, the Rambam says, how do you get rid of kas? How do you get rid of anger? The Rambam, profound piece of Maimonidean wisdom, the Rambam says, stop getting angry. Which I will say tells you something absolutely amazing. The Rambam's perspective was, you control who you are. You control what you are. People like to say, I have a bad temper, as if saying, I have a bad temper means I have, I have an illness. Like, a person says, I have diabetes. Never, a person has diabetes. Okay, they didn't choose that. That's what they have. A person, Rahman al-Islam, has cancer, has this, has that. Those, almost like a person says, I have a bad temper. As if it's saying, this. No, you choose. You may have been born. There was no question we're born with certain dispositions. So it could be you're born with a shorter fuse. That is absolutely possible. But it's you who chooses to maintain it, and it's you who chooses to ignite it. The Rambam says if you know that you struggle with anger, okay, got it, noted, control it. Stop getting angry, because when you don't, you continuously hit the frog. And when you don't, you kick people in the chest. Right? And when you don't, ultimately, again, you change the halachic and actual life realities all around you in every moment. Incredible. Let's go back there. Says the Gemara. Good. Amrle Rav Yemar the Ravashi. Ta'in kisei the kas of the kaspa v'yiramai. So let's listen to this. I burned down Reuven's house. And Reuven claims, there was a silver goblet in my house. You now owe me money for the silver goblet. So what's the halacha? So the shaila is, now that we know how it works, that ultimately when I burn down Reuven's house, I am liable for everything. And again, he takes an oath, and I pay him. We'll say, what about if he claims like a real outlier? Right? There was apparently a silver goblet. A silver goblet was very uncommon. So the Gemara says, Amarle, Chazina, I inish amit hu de isle kas de kaspa, right? Inami inish behem nohu. De mifkede inish gabe mishtaba v'shakil, ve'ilo laf kol kamini. So we look at him, either was he a wealthy enough guy that he has a silver goblet, or was he the kind of person who was very trustworthy and therefore someone would have deposited a silver goblet with him. So in other words, if the claim that Reuven is making is a little bit of an outlier claim, an item that people wouldn't normally have, so we assess him both on a personal wealth level as well as on a believability, a credibility level. Would he be the kind of person with whom others would deposit such an item with? And if the answer to either one of those two questions is yes, then he swears, and I have to pay him the value of the silver goblet. Amalei Rav Ada, Bereid Rav Avi Ravashi, Ma bin Gazlan lechamson. Let's see an interesting case over here. What is there between a Gazlan and a Chamson? Amalei Chamson Yoav Dimei, Gazlan lo Yoav Dimei. Both say here's the difference. A Gazlan steals, he's a thief. A Chamson, Rabbi say, pays money, but takes the item by force. In other words, he pays, but lav dafka, the seller wants to sell. Okay, so Rabbi say, so now watch this. Amrlei, Chamson Yoav Dimei, Gazlan lo Yoav Dimei, Amrlei, Yoav Dimei Chamson. I don't understand. If you're paying money, then why are you called a Chamson? What are you called? What are you called if you pay money? What are you called? A buyer. Someone says, "V'hamar rafuna taluha v'zavin zvine zvine." You will say the halacha is actually we're going to talk about this. If you force someone to sell and ultimately they sell, the sale is a valid sale in halacha. So we'll say, so that's not a chamson. Lo kasha hadam arotzani hadlo amarotzani. We'll say if at the end of the day the seller says, "Fine, I'll do it," then ultimately again, as much as it was a forced sale, the halacha recognizes it as a sale. Versus, I will say, if you give a person money, right? I throw the money at Reuven and I take the object. Reuven says, I don't want to sell. But I paid him the money. That's called a chamson. So ultimately, again, you're still called the thief, but it's a different gradation of theft. We'll talk about this one. We'll say, Amud Beis. Mishnah gets shiyatza mitachas hapatish. So we'll say, listen to this case. So we'll say, I'm a blacksmith and I'm banging away on the metal. And what happens? A spark flies out from under my hammer and goes and ignites a fire. So what's halacha? I'm chayv. I will say it's machlokes exactly what this is. But bepashtos, let's assume just because of the placement of this case in our parak that it's eish. So I'm chayv for my spark that then goes out and causes damage. Watch this. I have a camel, and I'm leading my camel through Rosh Hashanah, but my camel is laden. It's laden. So if you can imagine, like it has like wheat on it, right? So listen to this case. It's incredible. So now, my load of my camel extends into the store, right? Into one of the stores of Rosh Hashanah, is ignited by a candle inside of the store, and burns down the whole store. So what's the halacha? Ultimately, again, Bal Gamal Chayiv. I am Chayiv. Why am I Chayiv? Rabbi say why? Because I loaded my donkey in an irresponsible way. When you load your donkey, you're supposed to load it in, or your camel, you're supposed to load it in a way where the load doesn't extend into any of the stores, right? But I loaded it in an irresponsible way. Therefore, I am Chayiv for any subsequent damages that occur. Interesting. However, that's only if the candle of the shopkeeper was where? Inside the store. Because then the responsibility is on me because I irresponsibly loaded the donkey. However, if the chenveni went ahead and kept his fire outside, then what? Then the chenveni is liable. Why is he liable? Why? Because why are you keeping your candle outside? However, here we go. Rabbi Yehuda b'nei Chanukah pater. Rabbi Yehuda says, however, if the fire we're talking about is Ner Chanukah where there is a license and an obligation to keep it outside, then ultimately, again, the chenveni would be pater. Incredible. Let's analyze. Says the Gemara. Am Ravina Mishmei de Rava. Shma min Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda. Ner Chanukah mitzvah lahanicha b'soch hasara. So it says beautiful. What do you see from Yehuda? That Ner Chanukah, the mitzvah is to light the candle, to keep the candle within 10 tefachim to the ground. Right? Why? Because if that wasn't the case, the Sakadait Chanel Frabosai, therefore on Chanukah, I, right, who's leading my donkey through Rosh Hashanah, have an obligation to be cognizant that there are going to be menorahs outside, neros outside, and therefore the responsibility is on me to ultimately, again, avoid igniting the load on my camel. So you see from here, the mitzvah is to light it within 10 tvachim. Because if you could light it even above 10 tvachim, then why, ultimately, again, would the chendani be pater even for Ner Chanukah? After all, I, the owner of the camel, could say, listen, Ruvain, why don't you light your Ner Chanukah higher so that it's out of reach of my animal? The fact that I can't make that claim indicates that the mitzvah is to place Ner Chanukah within 10 tefachim of the ground. Therefore, Ruvain has every right to do so, and the responsibility is upon me to ensure that my animal does not ignite its load with the Ner Chanukah. Good. Says where maybe not. Maybe you could even light the Ner Chanukah above 10 tefachim. So the Gemara says, my amrit. So we'll say, based on that, you should say, I could say to Ruvain, you should have kept your Ner Chanukah even higher, and therefore would not have ignited the load of my camel. The Rabbi say, even though Ruvain could put it higher, since he's involved in a mitzvah, ultimately, again, Chazal did not occupy him with concerning himself with the height of the Ner Chanukah. Okay. Amrav Kana Darsh Rav Nassim Rabbi Yumi Shed Rabbi Tanchum Ner Chanukah Shenicha L'Mal Me'asara Me'esrim Ama Psula Kisuka Ukamavoy. We'll say again, just the last halacha, Ner Chanukah, even if you want to hold that Ner Chanukah could be above 10 tefachim, it cannot be above 20 amos. Right? Why can't it be above 20 amos? The same way that you can't make a sukkah that is taller than 20 amos, the same way that you can't place the lechi or the korah of a mavui above 20 amos as well. What's the logic? The logic is anything above 20 amos, lo shalta ba'ina. The eye doesn't really, there's no ocular recognition, right? The eye doesn't really see it. So Ner Chanukah ultimately, again, which is the mitzvah persumi nisa, has to be within, we'll call it recognition range, and ultimately, again, that has to be below 20 amos. So we'll say, we paskin like both of these things. In other words, we paskin that the ideal placement for Ner Chanukah, if you're lighting outside, is lamata miyud, within 10 tefachim, within 3 feet of the ground. That's the goal. That's the goal. We'll say why? Because it's recognizable. That also shows that it's not for illumination. Therefore, halacha l'maisa, in Rishus Harabim over Chanukah, I, the owner of the animal, have a responsibility to be cognizant of the presence of Neros Chanukah, and the responsibility is upon me to make sure that the load of my animal does not get ignited by any of the Neros Chanukah. During the rest of the year, no one has a right to put a fire in Rishus Harabim. And if they do and it ignites, they bear the responsibility. During the rest of the year, if my animal has a load and the load extends into Ruvain's store and is ignited there, responsibility is upon me. Sorry, one more piece. Ner Chanukah, you could go ahead, technically speaking, what if you lit it above 10 tefachim? You're yahrzeit, as long as what? As long as you lit it less than 20 amos. Good. I will say, Mazel Tov, Hadrun Alach, Hakones, Mazel Tov, beautiful, new parak. So Meruba, I will say, by the way, I still owe you, I'm not going to do it today just because of time. I still owe you, how do we paskin? Rabbi Hudin the Rabbanon, by TALMUD. Right? How do we paskin? Hold on to that, we'll do that tomorrow. Meruba, Midas Tashlumi Kev, Midas Tashlumi Abba Vechamisha. We'll say, listen to this. So we'll say, we're going to talk now about theft. In the world of theft, there are different types of repayment. So for example, there's kefil. What's kefil? Kefil is someone steals something, and we're going to see kefil only applies to geneva, not gizela. Two different types of theft, right? Gezel means visible theft. I go over to you, punch you, take your wallet. That's called gezel. Geneva is repetitious, right? Geneva ultimately, again, is done in secret, done repetitiously. We'll say, by gezel, the halacha is veheshav esakzela. You have to repay back that which you stole. That's what you stole. By Geneva, you have to pay back kefil, double. That's the halacha. One other piece, by Geneva, Rabbi say, if you steal livestock, and let's say you steal a sheep, or you steal an ox, and you slaughter it and you sell it, then there's another penalty. What is that called? Arba vechamisha. 4 or 5 times. 4 times the value of the sheep, 5 times the value of the ox or the cow. And we'll say that's another penalty, also by Geneva. So now watch this, says the Gemara. So we'll say, but that distinction of Gzela and Geneva, very important. Gzela, visible theft, right? Geneva, secret theft. Gezel, you're only obligated to pay back principal, whatever it is that you paid, right? Geneva, if you are found out, obligated to pay kefel, double. If you stole through Geneva, not an object, but livestock, and then you slaughtered it and sold it, arba v'chamisha. For a sheep, you have to pay 4 times the value of the sheep. For a cow, for an ox, for other types of livestock, 5 times the value of that item. Okay, so I will say that's the background. So meruba midas tashlumi kefel midas tashlumi arba v'chamisha. So in certain respects, kefel is more chamer than arba v'chamisha. How so? Shemidas tashlumi kefel no hages bein b'davar sheish bo ruach chaim bein b'davar shein bo ruach chaim. Let's say kefel applies whether you stole a living item or not, or an object, or an inanimate object. Umidas tashlumi arba v'chamisha ino no hages ela b'shar b'set bilbad. We'll say Abra Chamisha only applies if you stole livestock. If you stole livestock. Shene'emar, ki yignov ish shar oseh, o tevacho, o machro. The pasuk says, if a person will steal an ox or a sheep, and he will slaughter it or sell it, Chamisha bakar yishan tachas hashar, he has to pay 5 times the value of the ox, the arbetzon tachas aseh, and 4 times the value of the sheep. Now, why the distinction between how much you have to pay for a sheep, how much you have to pay for an ox? So we'll discuss. Ein hagonev achar haganav mishan tashlumi kefel. So what's another interesting case here? If you steal from a thief, in other words, I will say, watch this. I steal from Ruvain. I'm a ganav, right? I surreptitiously steal from Ruvain, and so now I'm chayiv kefel. Now Shimon steals the object from me. So what's the halacha? If you steal from a thief, you are not obligated ultimately in kefel. Something will say, watch this. If I steal a sheep or an ox from Ruvain, and then what happens? Right? I was going to slaughter it and sell it, but before I got a chance to, Shimon stole it from me. So again, Shimon doesn't have to pay arba v'chamisha 4 or 5 times. Okay, so obviously again, we'll say we'll unravel all of this. In the Gemara. Let's just begin a little bit. It says the Gemara v'ilu. So we'll say so that's the concept of gonev min haganav. If you steal from a thief, okay, good v'ilu midas tashlumi kefal no hages bein beganav bein between tanas ganav umidas tashlumi arba v'chamisha eno no hages ela beganav bilvar v'lo katoni. So we'll say listen to this. Let's just talk about this outside for just a second, and then we'll stop for today. I will say there are 2 possible cases of ganav, right? What are the 2 possible cases of ganav? I will say one is I actually go over to Ruvain and I steal something from Ruvain surreptitiously, right? Secretly, quietly. That's one case of ganav. What's the other case of ganav? Ruvain deposits something with me, right? Then he comes to get it back, and I say to him, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't have the object. And then it turns out that I do have the object. That's also a case of Geneva. So I will say, so we'll stop over here for today, but the Gemara wants to make this distinction ultimately, or is there a distinction between a straight out ganav, versus a person who was rightfully given the object as a deposit to hold on to, but then denies that he ever had it. So we'll say, we'll leave off with that case. Mazdav, I'll finish in the parak. Shkoyach. All right, everyone, have a great day, everyone.